On this episode of the AAF Exchange, the latest inflation and economic numbers, the legislative agenda, and CBO's budget and economic outlook. Joining us to discuss all of this is AAF's Douglas Holtz-Eakin. Doug, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
How have you been?
Fun. Doing great. Playing?
Yeah, same here. Football season's over, so it's a little bit in that moment where I'm like, what am I going to do for the next 7 months? But hopefully, baseball's...
My wife and I had this conversation the other night. We're like, what are we going to watch?
Yeah, baseball season is around the corner, so hopefully that'll save us there. Before we jump into everything, we're going to do Doug's reaction. So tell us, what's on your mind, Doug?
Economic appointments in the administration. Like, they're shuffling folks around. Brian Deese has left as NEC director, and they brought Lael Brainerd in. She was the vice chairman of the Fed. Lael's top-notch appointee. There's no issue there. But I didn't really like the way they handled it because of the implications for the Fed. They floated her name a week in advance along with other people. So that raises the specter of her not getting the job, but having been openly considered as appropriate for the job by the White House, and there's supposed to be independence at the Fed. And that, I didn't like the way that looked. I thought it was just a little bit bad for the Fed. But she's there now. It would have been better if they just said, it's her, and she comes over, none of that waiting around. So that's number one. Number two, Jared Bernstein is now going to be the CEA chairman. I follow the CEA carefully because I was there twice, and Jared's the perfect kind of pick. The CEA is as important as is the relationship between the chairman and the president. And Jared was Biden's economic advisor when he was vice president. They've had a long history, and so that's a good thing for the CEA to have him in that job. Now, the last one is who replaces Lael Brainerd over at the Fed. And this has gotten interesting because they've quickly floated Austan Goolsbee. Austin's an old friend and foe. He was on the Obama campaign. I've debated him a million times. He's a really good economist, and only recently left the University of Chicago to become president of the Chicago Federal Reserve Bank. So he's been in that job months, not years, and now they're floating him as the vice chairman candidate. Meanwhile, up on Capitol Hill, the Senate is looking at making sure that diversity is present at the Fed, and in particular, Menendez is saying there's never been a Hispanic at the Federal Reserve, so that seems to be his top priority. Well, Austin's not a Hispanic, so I'm interested to see how this is all going to play out.
Yeah, sounds like we got some musical chairs going on with economic advisors.
Musical chairs and gossip. What could be better?
Washington's favorite pastime. All right, let's start with our actual with what we are going to talk about today, where we often do the state of the economy. Tuesday's Consumer Price Index report was a little bit of a mixed bag. What did we learn about the efforts to control inflation?
Well, I think it's fair to say that inflation has come down. No doubt about that. We got additional information this morning on the Producer Price Index, which was 6% year over year at the top line. A bit under that for the core, 5.5. So those are both down from previous readings, but they're not 2. They're a long way from 2, and they're not coming down that fast. So I think it's roughly fair to say that inflation has come down, but appears to be moderating slowly from its current levels, and that's a concern. People really would like to see this happen faster. Powell, the chairman of the Federal Reserve Board, warned everyone that it was going to take years. 2024 could be a bumpy ride getting there. These two reports are consistent with that.
Yeah, it sounds like a lot of the rhetoric you're hearing out of the Fed is bumpy ride. It's going to be where I think you've mentioned before 2024 is their aim. We're still a long way from that 2% number, so it seems like good that it's coming down, but still a long way to go.
I think there's no question about that. I see this as a real sort of public relations tug-of-war between the easy money crowd on Wall Street that had zero interest rates and then on top of it had $90 billion a month shoveled toward them for 2 years, that they got used to doing business that way. I mean, so there are people who went to work on Wall Street in 2010 who've never seen positive interest rates before. They are losing their minds, and they keep trying to make the case that the Fed has done enough and they need to quit or even change course. The data aren't with them, and that's that.
Interesting. We also saw the latest report on retail sales numbers this week. What was the news here?
We reversed the previous 2 months of declines with a very strong growth in retail sales. Retail sales are measured nominally, so when you're in an inflationary environment, you get big numbers anyway. And so, but even adjusted for that, I think this tells us one more time, the death of the American household spending is just premature. I mean, the households are in pretty good shape. They're continuing to spend. The level of retail sales is quite high, and if you're looking for weakness in a recession, you have to look over at the business sector and see how they're doing.
Interesting. All right, let's turn to Congress, which seems to be firing up, at least on the hearing front. In fact, you testified yesterday before the Senate Budget Committee on climate-related risk to the budget and the economy. What key points did you make to the committee?
So it's clear that climate change is going to affect the federal budget. I mean, we will have floods and coastal sea level rise, and that'll put pressure on the National Flood Insurance Program. We'll have disaster relief efforts. There'll be all sorts of spending that will go out as a result of climate-related activities. Congress may choose to do some things. So, again, there can be legislative initiatives to do mitigation or adaptation spending. But the biggest impact is going to be that the economy will grow more slowly, and that'll slow the growth of tax revenues and reduce the inflow of the revenues in the budget. And so we're going to get bigger deficits going forward. So looking at that economic channel, the CBO did a survey of estimates, and it said that, roughly the median point of those estimates is that GDP will be lower by 1% in 2051 as a result of climate change. That's the equivalent of having under 0.1% slower growth. It's actually 0.03% slower growth over the next couple of decades. That's not a big change in economic growth. By contrast, we are at the Budget Committee. The federal budget is an enormous headwind to growth. And there are estimates that say, given our debt load, we're growing maybe a percentage point slower per year than we should be. That swamps the climate issue. My message is, let's take care of the budgetary problems, get rid of that headwind to growth. And by the way, in the process, you will free up funds for other uses like climate change mitigation and adaptation. So that was the message I wanted to send. It's not uniformly popular. For people who want climate to be the thing and only thing, talking about the budget looks like a distraction.
Yeah, it seems like that, some of these hearings are a little bit more focused on the messaging, hearings rather than bills and things like that. So more broadly speaking, with that focus pretty heavily on these messaging hearings, how do you think this will impact the legislative agenda at large?
The legislative agenda is pretty thin, right? That it is the job of the House, the Senate, and the President to pass legislation that's in the national interest. That would be raise the debt limit. It would be fund the government. Past that, it's going to depend on events, of course, but the knowable things are what happens in Ukraine and the next election. So that's what we're going to see, and so there's not a big legislative agenda out there.
So we're going to be looking at a lot of these messaging hearings where they're setting up sort of the agenda for the next election and what potentially candidates might run on.
Certainly there will be that. There will also be just their hobby horses and pet peeves. The House Judiciary Committee's just issued subpoenas for the heads of 4 big tech companies. The last Congress, the Democrats did the same thing. Everyone hates the big tech companies for different reasons, so we're just going to see that play out over these kinds of hearings.
Interesting. All right, at this point, let's take our break and do our segment on called Fact of the Day Trivia. So here's your facts of the day. At this point in their respective terms, the Biden administration is outpacing the Obama administration in total regulatory costs. By how much?
But 2 years in, they're up about $60 billion.
$150 billion.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
I think we've talked about this many times. They're really
I knew
doing policy
through
regulatory policy. Yeah. Dan Goldbeck and Dan had the halfway point tracker piece insight that he did that outlined all this. But yeah,
I guess that's right. The Obama first term is going to be heavily backloaded because 2010 is Dodd-Frank, ACA, And so they'll make a desperate attempt to catch up, but the Biden guys have got the early lead, that's for sure.
Do you think this means? Do you think we're going to expect even more going forward in the next 2 years?
Yeah, I think legislatively there's not a lot of prospects. That pushes you into the administrative action realm, and the top initiatives have to be implemented. So now they've passed the Inflation Reduction Act, and they've got in there regulations on the prescription drug negotiations, things like that. They've got regulations on implementing all of the green energy tax credits, hundreds of billions of dollars of them. Now remember, there is this thing called the Congressional Review Act that allows a Congress to go back and repeal regulations if they're done in the last 60 legislative days of the previous Congress. So they're going to have their foot to the gas to get those regulations done, so they are safe from the risk of a future Republican-controlled Congress going back and taking them out.
Interesting. All right, let's end today by talking about CBO's baseline that was finally released this week. What did we learn?
Everything you know about the federal budget is much worse. That in a nutshell is what we learned from the CBO. We knew there were deficits. There are really a lot of deficits. They're going to average over $2 trillion over the next 10 years. We knew there was a lot of debt, and we were on a record-setting pace, in the worst sense of that word. We're now going to exceed the World War II maximum of debt as a fraction of GDP 3 years earlier than even last May. So most of these changes are due to actions of Congress, legislative actions. And so we got an enormous amount of red ink. The fastest growing part of the budget is net interest, and it's on a trajectory to exceed defense spending in every other agency's operating budget. So that's a sort of daunting proposition. And inside, the really big spending programs are growing very fast. Those are Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, Affordable Care Act. But, this comes simultaneously with a great public pledge to not touch those programs, which I would politely say is insanity. I mean, it is an absolute necessity that we, quote, touch those programs, if only for the seniors themselves. I mean, it's a point I tried to make at the Senate Budget Committee yesterday. Think about Social Security. Social Security was invented to reduce income uncertainty for seniors. They would have something to rely on in their elder years. It is now the greatest source of income uncertainty for seniors because we have no idea what's going to happen in 10 years. People trying to plan can't make a sensible plan. I think that's criminal. I mean, that needs to get fixed and fixed fast.
Yeah, we're under 10 years away from these programs being
We are certainly under 10 for Medicare Part A, the hospitals, so the inpatient care. And Social Security depends on whether you look at CBO, which has it a little bit earlier, or the actuary, but we're in the 10-year range on the Social Security Administration.
Yeah, and one of the things I picked out going back to your hearing yesterday, everyone says there's a lot of blame to go around, but fixing these doesn't really seem to be at the top of their minds based off of, the questions that were asked at the hearings yesterday.
No, I would say that this is not on the top of anyone's agenda, and I think it's because of what you saw with the president at the State of the Union, where, the notion that somehow they would touch these programs was just made politically inviolable because of his demand that everyone pledge to not do it. That's just not the right course for the country. And it doesn't do anyone a favor to mislead the American public and say it's just fine. It's not fine, and needs to be taken a close look at and make the program sustainable. I mean, these are core pieces of the social safety net. It's not right that they're in such bad shape. They should be fixed up.
Right. One of the other things that this is the first step in the federal budget process. So what comes next in the federal budget process? I mean, they say they want to do the appropriations bills and they want to do a budget resolution, but what comes next year?
Well, next is the president's budget. He will submit his budget a month late, but they'll see it at the beginning of March. That gives the Democrats at least some marching orders on things that they should be trying to accomplish. In principle, the step after that is budget resolution in the House, budget resolution in the Senate, try to get to a joint budget resolution, and that would give directions to the Appropriations Committee on how much money they have to spend, and would give directions to the authorizing committees on mandatory programs like Social Security and Medicare. What do they need to do? The Senate's not going to do a budget resolution. No one has said anything, but they will not, and that means that this process will be strictly in the House. They'll do a budget resolution. That will be deemed dead on arrival at the White House, and so appropriations bills written to match that budget resolution will not get through the Senate. And how it ends, I'm not sure, but we're not going to see regular order. We're going to be back to some sort of ad hoc procedure that gets us to September 30th and hopefully keeps the government open and funded.
Yeah, nobody's going to like that. Nobody's going to like that process at all. Yeah, I think we got a lot to talk about on the federal budget process. So hopefully we're going to do, I think in the future podcast, to do a deep dive with Gordon Gray,
that would be great.
Our Director of Fiscal Policy, so he can come down and break it down for people. But anyways, we'll leave it there for now. Doug, thanks as always for joining us, and thanks everyone for listening.
Thank you.